Dust motes danced in the single shaft of late afternoon sun piercing the high, arched window of the archive. Blake, hunched over a vast oak table, paid them no mind. Their focus was absolute, each movement precise, a silent testament to a life built on order and meticulous classification. The air, thick with the scent of aged paper and dry wood, was Blake's sanctuary, a quiet realm where chaos was meticulously catalogued, contained, and understood. Today's task involved a collection of forgotten land deeds, brittle and faded, from a defunct regional office. Blake worked with the reverence of an archaeologist, carefully unrolling each scroll, noting the intricate cursive, the precise dates, the faded official stamps. Every document held a story, a fragment of history, and Blake's role was to ensure its preservation, its place within the grand, interconnected web of recorded existence. They found profound satisfaction in this process, in the certainty of facts, the logic of sequential dates, the undeniable weight of physical evidence. It was amidst this routine, buried beneath a stack of inventories that should have been processed decades prior, that the anomaly surfaced. It wasn't a document. It was a small, irregular object, wrapped in a coarse, dark linen that felt strangely resistant to the touch, almost like dried, hardened clay, yet yielding slightly under pressure. Blake's gloved fingers paused. This item was not listed on any manifest, nor did its presence align with the collection's provenance. It simply was. Carefully, Blake unwrapped the linen. What lay revealed was not metal, not stone, nor any material immediately recognizable. It was a dense, dark mass, roughly the size of a clenched fist, with a surface that seemed to absorb the ambient light rather than reflect it. Its texture was a bewildering paradox, smooth in places, yet riddled with minute, almost microscopic ridges that felt like petrified nerve endings. A prickle of unease, faint but distinct, traced its way up Blake's arm. This was not the familiar discomfort of an uncatalogued item, it was a deeper, more fundamental dissonance. Blake turned the object over, examining it from every angle. It possessed no discernible features, no engravings, no marks, no indication of its purpose or origin. Blake pulled out a magnifying glass, their brow furrowed in concentration. Under magnification, the minute ridges became a labyrinthine network, an impossibly intricate pattern that seemed to shift and reconfigure itself at the very edge of perception. Blake blinked, adjusting their grip. The pattern settled, but the sensation of movement lingered, a phantom impression on the retina. It was as if the object itself resisted being fully observed, its details blurring just as the mind tried to grasp them. This wasn't right. Every artifact, no matter how obscure, fit into a category, a historical context, a material science. This object defied all known classifications. Blake tried to remember if they had ever encountered anything remotely similar in their decades of archival work. Nothing. The memory banks, usually a vast and reliable index, offered only a blank space where this object should logically fit. A hairline crack formed in the pristine facade of Blake's certainty. How could something exist without precedent? They placed the object on a clean, white sheet of archival paper, a stark contrast to its light-devouring surface. It sat there, inert, yet its presence seemed to hum with a silent, insistent wrongness. Blake felt a growing tension in their shoulders, a subtle tightening in their chest. The ordered world of the archive, usually a source of comfort, now felt subtly off-kilter, skewed by the alien geometry of this single, unyielding thing. Hours passed. Blake remained, poring over reference texts, cross-referencing material compositions, historical records, geological formations. The more Blake sought to understand it, the more their own understanding of the world seemed to fray at the edges. Leaving the archive building, the biting winter air hit Blake with a shock. The streets were quiet, slick with a thin layer of ice. Blake found themselves walking instinctively towards the edge of town, towards the expansive, desolate flatness of the frozen lake. The vast sheet of ice, shimmering under the distant streetlights, usually offered a sense of calm, a stark, beautiful simplicity. Tonight, however, it felt different. Blake's fingers, stained with ancient ink and the fine grit of forgotten manuscripts, traced the cold, smooth surface of the artifact. It was heavier than it appeared, a dense, obsidian-like stone, cool to the touch despite the warmth of Blake's grip. The intricate carvings, a swirling vortex of impossible angles and non-Euclidean geometry, seemed to shift under direct observation, subtly reconfiguring themselves when Blake blinked. This illusion, if it was an illusion, had intensified over the past few days. Blake had plunged into the archive's deepest recesses, driven by a compulsion that felt less like academic curiosity and more like a fever. Old charts, astronomical observations from forgotten cultures, and theological texts deemed heretical by centuries of orthodoxy were pulled from their lightless shelves. Blake sought patterns, any echo of the artifact's strange, non-repeating symbols. The only colleague in the vast building, a senior archivist, offered a concerned glance over spectacles, but Blake merely grunted, dismissing the unspoken inquiry. The connections Blake found were tenuous at first, whispers across millennia, but they began to coalesce with an unnerving precision. Blake started to perceive the archive differently. The familiar scent of aging paper and dust now carried an undertone, metallic and faintly acrid, like ozone before a storm. The creaks and groans of the old building, once comforting, became deliberate, almost predatory. Sometimes, Blake heard a faint, high-pitched hum, just at the edge of hearing, a sound like a distant, massive engine vibrating through the earth. Blake would pause, head cocked, listening, but the sound always receded before it could be definitively located. Was it the building settling? Or something else, something closer, something inside? Sleep offered no respite. Blake's nights were a fractured mosaic of half-waking states, the artifact's patterns etched onto the inside of their eyelids, morphing into vast, silent landscapes of frozen, alien structures. Blake would wake with a start, heart thrumming, the phantom hum still resonating in their ears, the taste of ash in their mouth. Blake barely recognized the gaunt face. This relentless investigation, this unraveling, was consuming them. A profound sense of isolation began to settle. Blake avoided the small break room, the casual exchanges about mundane administrative tasks. Blake felt like a solitary cartographer, charting a territory that no human mind was meant to comprehend, and the burden of that knowledge was crushing. Were these connections real? Or was the artifact merely a catalyst, a trigger for a latent paranoia, a slow descent into delusion? The hum intensified one afternoon, a low thrumming that resonated in Blake's molars. The archive felt suddenly too small, the air too thin. Without a conscious decision, Blake pushed away from the table, grabbed a worn jacket, and walked out of the archive into the biting winter air. The need for open space pulled Blake towards the edge of town, where the land stretched flat and desolate. The wind whipped across the barren fields, carrying the scent of pine and ice. Blake walked until the familiar landmarks faded, until the only sound was the crunch of snow underfoot and the desolate howl of the wind. Blake stopped at the edge of a vast, flat expanse. The frozen lake stretched before them, a sheet of milky white under a bruised, leaden sky. The ice groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the very core of the earth, mirroring the hum that still vibrated faintly in Blake's bones. Blake walked out onto the ice, the world suddenly reduced to this stark, terrifying canvas. The lake was not merely frozen water, it was a lid, a barrier. The archive, the artifact, the lake, it was all connected, a tapestry of escalating horror, and Blake was inexorably caught in its threads. The intricate carvings, a swirling vortex of impossible geometry, now seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light. They had spent days, weeks, poring over fragmented texts, forgotten ciphers, and whispered legends, all hinting at this object, this key. The archival chamber, usually a sanctuary of hushed reverence and dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, began to warp. The shelves, laden with centuries of recorded thought, appeared to recede, their edges blurring into a soft, gray haze. Blake blinked, trying to clear their vision, but the distortion persisted. A low, resonant frequency vibrated through the floorboards, through Blake's very bones. It was not a sound heard with ears, but felt in the deepest recesses of their skull. Blake clutched the artifact tighter. The carvings no longer just pulsed, they writhed. Lines shifted, angles became acute, then impossibly obtuse, forming and reforming patterns that no human hand could conceive. Blake felt a sudden, profound disorientation, as if the room itself had tilted, or perhaps their own internal gyroscope had failed. They stumbled, catching themselves on a heavy oak desk, sending a cascade of brittle parchment to the floor. A single, clear thought, not their own, crystallized in Blake's mind: the frozen lake. The instruction was not spoken, yet it resonated with an authority that bypassed reason. Blake knew, with an unsettling certainty, that they had to go. There was no debate, no internal struggle, only an immediate, unyielding compulsion. The archival chamber, with its familiar scent of aged paper and leather, now felt like a cage. Blake's determination, honed by years of meticulous research, now focused solely on this new, unbidden directive. The journey was a blur of distorted perceptions. The familiar city streets seemed to stretch and contract, buildings leaning at impossible angles, the sounds of traffic muted and distant, like echoes from another dimension. Blake walked, propelled by the artifact's silent command, their breath pluming in the frigid evening air. The pressure behind their eyes intensified, a constant, dull ache that threatened to split their skull. The world outside the archival chamber offered no solace, only a broader canvas for the subtle unraveling of reality. Finally, the landscape opened up, revealing the vast expanse of the frozen lake. The lake was a desolate, magnificent sheet of pale gray, crisscrossed with fissures that looked like ancient scars. The wind, sharp and biting, whipped across the exposed surface, carrying with it the faint, metallic scent that had permeated the archival chamber. Blake stood at the edge, the artifact now throbbing with a distinct, rhythmic pulse against their palm. The ice groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated up through the frozen earth. It was not the natural creak of a massive body of water under pressure, but something more deliberate, more alive. Blake stepped onto the ice, each crunching stride sending tremors through the surface. As Blake reached the approximate center, the artifact began to hum violently, its obsidian surface growing warm, then searing hot against their skin. The carvings on it began to glow, a deep, internal violet light that pulsed in rhythm with the ice's groans. The air above the frozen lake shimmered, not with heat, but with an optical distortion, like looking through warped glass. Blake stared at their reflection in the glassy ice, but it was not their own face that stared back. The truth descended then, not as a vision or a voice, but as a direct, overwhelming transmission of pure knowledge into Blake's mind. The artifact was not merely a key, but a lens, a conduit. It showed them the true nature of the space they inhabited, the thinness of the veil that separated their reality from another. There was no cosmic battle, no invading force, no alien consciousness. There was only depth. An endless, indifferent, unfathomable depth that lay just beneath the surface of everything. Blake understood that the familiar world, with its laws and its logic, was a momentary ripple on an ocean of incomprehensible scale. The horror was not an entity, but the sheer, crushing reality of their own insignificance, the arbitrary nature of existence. Their mind, designed for 3 dimensions and linear time, struggled to contain the multi-dimensional, nonlinear truth. The pressure behind their eyes became unbearable, their skull threatening to fracture. They gasped, a ragged sound torn from their throat, as the violet light from the artifact flared, illuminating the vast, indifferent expanse of the frozen lake and the terrifying, beautiful nothingness that lay beyond it. The world had not ended, it had merely revealed its true, horrifying face. And Blake, the archivist, was now privy to its secret.